Good morning/afternoon/evening, everyone. Today, I stand before you to shed light on a powerful truth hidden behind world politics: how America, in its attempts to weaken India, actually ended up hurting itself. History has shown us that strategies driven by arrogance, dominance, and underestimation often backfire, and in this case, every move that was meant to pull India down only made our nation rise stronger, prouder, and more influential on the global stage. This is not just a story of politics, it is a story of resilience, self-reliance, and the unstoppable spirit of India. Let us dive deep into how America's miscalculations turned into India's strength, and ultimately America's loss. America's strategy of dominance backfired against India because it was based on the wrong assumptions about power, dependency, and control. For decades, the United States followed a foreign policy pattern where it tried to influence or pressure other nations to align with its interests. India, being a rapidly growing economy with vast resources, became one of the focal points of this strategy. The U.S. thought that by using its military superiority, economic clout, and global alliances, it could dictate terms to India or at least slow down its rise. However, what was not fully understood was the spirit of independence deeply rooted in India's history. A nation that fought for freedom through nonviolence, endured centuries of colonial exploitation, and rebuilt itself after independence was not going to easily bow down to external dominance. One of the key mistakes in America's approach was underestimating India's resilience. When the U.S. tried to impose restrictions, whether in the form of technology denials, sanctions, or diplomatic pressure, it assumed that India would not have the capacity to respond strongly. For example, in the past, when the U.S. attempted to block India's access to critical technologies in defense and space, it believed that India would remain dependent and unable to progress. Instead, India turned inward, developed indigenous systems, and created its own path toward technological and military advancement. What was meant to weaken India ended up making it stronger and more self-reliant. Another factor that made this strategy fail was America's misjudgment of India's global standing. And like smaller nations that often buckle under pressure, India already had a unique position as the world's largest democracy, a civilizational powerhouse, and an emerging economy with massive potential. America's efforts to dominate overlooked the fact that other countries, whether in Asia, Africa, or Europe, saw India as a trustworthy partner and counterbalance in global politics. Instead of isolating India, America's aggressive posturing pushed more countries to strengthen ties with New Delhi. In many ways, this expanded India's diplomatic space and gave it greater freedom to chart its own course. The strategy also backfired because of the psychological effect it had within India. Every time America tried to assert dominance, it fueled a sense of national pride and unity among Indians. Leaders, policymakers, and even ordinary citizens viewed these pressures as a challenge to India's sovereignty. This, in turn, created a stronger determination to prove America wrong. Far from breaking India's confidence, it ignited a spirit of defiance and innovation that accelerated India's growth in science, defense, and technology. Most importantly, America's dominance strategy failed because it was rooted in short-term thinking. The U.S. treated India as a country to be contained, while India saw itself as a civilization with a long-term destiny. This difference in perspective meant that America's actions, instead of weakening India, became stepping stones for India's rise. By trying to dominate, America only ended up strengthening India's independence, deepening its self-confidence, and forcing it to achieve the very capabilities the U.S. wanted to block. In the end, the strategy of dominance turned into a lesson in humility for America and a victory for India's resilience. India turned pressure into self-reliance and strength because every challenge imposed on it by America became an opportunity to innovate and grow. When the U.S. tried to create obstacles, whether through sanctions, restrictions on trade, denial of technology, or diplomatic pressure. It believed these actions would weaken India's progress. Instead, India adapted to the circumstances, transformed external pressure into internal motivation, and emerged stronger than before. This transformation is one of the clearest examples of how adversity can act as fuel for growth. Whenever the U.S. denied India access to advanced technologies, Indian scientists and policymakers responded by developing indigenous capabilities. A prime example is the nuclear and space program. When America and its allies restricted the export of crucial components after India's nuclear tests, India did not step back or surrender. Rather, it pushed its scientists to create homegrown solutions. Over time, this led to remarkable achievements like the development of powerful missile systems, the establishment of a strong nuclear program, and the success of ISRO in space exploration. Each restriction forced India to dig deeper into its own talent pool, and the result was self-reliance on critical fronts where dependency could have been dangerous. Economic pressure also had a similar effect. Sanctions and restrictions made India realize that depending on external powers for essentials was risky. This motivated successive governments to strengthen domestic industries, diversify trade partnerships, and reduce vulnerabilities. From agriculture to pharmaceuticals, India built resilience that not only ensured survival during difficult times, but also positioned the country as a global supplier. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, India's pharmaceutical industry, once seen as dependent on Western technology, emerged as a lifesaver for the world by producing affordable vaccines and medicines at scale. This self-reliant strength was born from years of learning to overcome external pressure. Diplomatic pressure also failed to corner India. When America tried to align India into its sphere of influence or penalize it for choosing an independent foreign policy, India refused to bend. Instead of being intimidated, New Delhi used such moments to assert its sovereignty more strongly. India's policy of non-alignment and later its strategic autonomy allowed it to maintain relationships with multiple global powers without being controlled by any single one. This independence, tested under American pressure, made India a credible and respected voice in international forums. Far from being weakened, India's standing in the world grew stronger as other countries admired its ability to resist dominance and chart its own course. The most profound impact of this transformation was psychological. Pressure from America made Indians more determined to prove their capabilities. Every sanction, denial, or act of arrogance was seen as a challenge to be overcome. It created a mindset of innovation, perseverance, and national pride that fueled progress in science, economy, and diplomacy. What was intended to break India's confidence instead made it more ambitious and forward-looking. Over time, this resilience evolved into strength, allowing India not only to withstand pressure, but to thrive because of it. Economic sanctions, when imposed with the intention of weakening India, ended up serving as a catalyst for growth, innovation, and independence. America believed that by cutting off resources, restricting trade, and limiting access to global markets or technology, India would be forced to comply with its demands. Instead, India transformed these very sanctions into opportunities to strengthen domestic industries, foster innovation, and reduce dependence on foreign powers. What began as a setback turned into a defining chapter in India's journey toward economic self-reliance. When sanctions were applied after India's nuclear tests, the United States and its allies assumed that depriving India of foreign technology and financial assistance would cripple its development. However, these restrictions had the opposite effect. Indian scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs were forced to innovate, creating indigenous alternatives that proved to be both reliable and cost-effective. In the defense sector, this meant developing homegrown missile systems, nuclear technology, and other strategic capabilities. In space research, ISRO continued to make groundbreaking progress despite being cut off from critical foreign supplies. Rather than halting India's rise, sanctions motivated the country to build technologies that would have otherwise taken much longer to develop. The economic sector also witnessed a transformation under pressure. India began to understand the importance of diversifying its trade partners and strengthening domestic production. With restrictions limiting access to American and Western markets, Indian industries expanded their reach to Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. This shift not only reduced vulnerability, but also gave India a stronger foothold in emerging markets. Over time, India built global partnerships that were more balanced and less dependent on a single dominant power. What was meant to isolate India only increased its connections with the rest of the world. Sanctions also encouraged India to adopt reforms and policies aimed at strengthening its internal economy. Instead of seeing itself as reliant on Western investment and imports, India invested in its own industries and capabilities. This is evident in sectors such as pharmaceuticals, information technology, and agriculture, where India became not just self-sufficient but also an exporter to the world. The pharmaceutical industry, in particular, flourished under pressure, eventually becoming the backbone of affordable medicine production worldwide. Today, India is known as the pharmacy of the world, a reputation that grew from the very hardships intended to hold it back. Beyond material progress, sanctions created a shift in India's mindset. They taught the country that dependence is a weakness and that true strength comes from the ability to stand on one's own. This realization nurtured a culture of innovation, resilience, and strategic thinking across government, industries, and society. Instead of yielding to external pressure, India embraced the challenge and turned it into a source of pride and determination. In the end, the sanctions designed to harm India did not succeed. They became the reason India strengthened its industries, diversified its global ties, and learned to innovate under pressure. What was meant to break India's progress ended up accelerating it, proving once again that obstacles often become the foundation for strength and independence. America underestimated India's global influence, and this miscalculation became one of the biggest reasons its attempts to weaken India ended up failing. For a long time, the United States viewed India primarily as a developing country with limited power, assuming that sanctions or pressure would isolate it and force it to compromise. What America overlooked was the fact that India was not just another nation. It was a civilizational power, a rising economy, and a trusted partner for many countries across the world. Instead of being cornered, India's influence grew stronger as nations recognized its importance and rallied around it. One of the key reasons America miscalculated was India's position as the world's largest democracy. At a time when authoritarian regimes dominated in many regions, India stood as a symbol of democratic values, freedom, and stability. This gave it immense credibility in international forums. When America tried to isolate India after its nuclear tests, countries across Asia, Africa, and even Europe refused to fully back U.S. pressure. Many saw India's nuclear program as an assertion of sovereignty rather than aggression. By underestimating the respect India commanded globally, the U.S. failed to achieve its goal of turning the world against New Delhi. India's economic potential was another factor America ignored. Even during times of restrictions, India's massive population, growing industries, and expanding markets made it an attractive partner for countries worldwide. While Washington tried to impose limits, other nations saw opportunities. Japan, Russia, and later even the European Union deepened trade and strategic ties with India, recognizing its role as a future economic powerhouse. Instead of being isolated, India diversified its partnerships and strengthened its position in the global economy. America's pressure campaign simply highlighted India's importance to others. Culturally and historically, too, India's soft power was underestimated. The country's long tradition of spirituality, philosophy, and nonviolence had already earned it admiration worldwide. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi inspired movements across continents, and this legacy continued to shape how the world viewed India. In addition, India's diaspora spread across the globe became an influential force in politics, business, and academia. From Silicon Valley in the U.S. to universities in Europe, Indian talent was shaping the future. This global network gave India influence far beyond what America had calculated. Diplomatically, India proved far more skilled than the U.S. had anticipated by balancing relations with multiple powers, Russia, China, Europe, the Middle East, and the U.S. itself. India demonstrated an ability to act independently and strategically. When America expected India to bend under pressure, New Delhi instead built stronger ties with alternative partners. This diplomatic independence elevated India's role as a key decision maker in global issues, whether in trade, security, or climate change. America's failure to recognize this strength meant that its pressure tactics were ineffective. Ultimately, by underestimating India's global influence, America misread the situation entirely. Instead of isolating India, it highlighted its importance. Instead of weakening India's voice, it amplified it. The world began to see India not as a country to be dominated, but as a nation that could not be ignored. In trying to undermine India, America only revealed to the world how powerful and influential India already was, and how much stronger it was destined to become. India's rise shifted global power equations in ways America did not anticipate. For decades, the United States operated as if it were the sole center of global influence, assuming that its dominance in military, economic, and technological fields would remain unchallenged. But when America tried to weaken India, it unintentionally accelerated India's journey toward becoming a global power, changing the balance of international relations. Instead of remaining a regional player, India began to assert itself as a global leader, reshaping alliances, partnerships, and the overall structure of world politics. One of the most significant shifts came in the economic arena. America believed that restrictions and pressure would slow India's growth, but instead, India diversified its trade and investment networks. By strengthening ties with Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, India reduced its dependency on any single power and positioned itself as an essential link in global trade. Over time, India emerged as one of the fastest growing major economies, and this growth gave it a stronger voice in global financial and economic forums such as the G20 and BRICS. The very attempts to suppress India's rise only encouraged it to seek out new economic alliances, which altered the balance of power away from a U.S.-centric order. In security and defense, India's rise also reshaped global equations. America's restrictions on defense technologies pushed India to strengthen its own indigenous capabilities and to collaborate more deeply with other partners like Russia, France, and later even Israel. Over time, India became not only a strong defense power in South Asia, but also a country capable of influencing security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region. Its growing naval presence, combined with strategic partnerships, made India a crucial player in balancing power between East and West. This shift reduced America's ability to dictate security policies unilaterally in the region. Diplomatically, India's rise created a new voice for the global South. Many developing nations, which often felt sidelined in the U.S.-dominated international order, began looking to India as a partner and advocate. India's history as a leader of the non-aligned movement gave it credibility, and its growing strength allowed it to speak for countries that were otherwise ignored. Whether it was in climate negotiations, trade discussions, or peacekeeping missions, India's role began to reshape international decision-making. America no longer found it easy to control outcomes without considering India's position. Culturally and strategically, India's rise also brought new dynamics. The Indian diaspora around the world became more influential. representing not only cultural ties, but also political and economic strength. India's soft power, combined with its strategic autonomy, made it a nation that could bridge divides between East and West, North and South. This unique position allowed India to play roles that America could not, whether as a mediator, a partner, or a counterbalance. In the end, America's attempts to weaken India only sped up the process of global rebalancing. India's growth, resilience, and independence created a multipolar world where power was shared among several nations rather than controlled by one. By trying to contain India, America inadvertently helped create a world in which its own dominance was reduced. The rise of India permanently shifted global power equations, proving that no single country could dictate terms to the rest of the world anymore. The attempt to harm India ended up isolating America, because every move made against India revealed not only the flaws in U.S. strategy, but also the growing irrelevance of unilateral pressure in a multipolar world. America assumed that by imposing sanctions, using its diplomatic weight, or threatening economic consequences, other nations would rally behind it and India would be forced into submission. What actually happened was the opposite. India held its ground. Other countries respected its sovereignty, and America increasingly appeared aggressive, arrogant, and out of touch with global realities. Instead of weakening India, these actions eroded America's credibility and influence. When the United States tried to isolate India after its nuclear tests, it expected the world to follow its lead. While a few Western allies initially aligned with Washington, the broader international community refused to treat India as a pariah. Russia continued strong defense and energy ties with India. France maintained cooperation, and many Asian and African nations supported India's right to security and sovereignty. This refusal to collectively punish India showed that America's dominance was no longer absolute. Instead of being isolated, India became even more respected for standing firm against pressure, while America looked increasingly alone in its hardline stance. Economically, sanctions also exposed America's limited leverage. While restrictions were meant to choke India's access to resources and technology, India quickly found alternatives. Trade with Russia, the Middle East, and East Asia deepened, and partnerships in Europe became stronger. India's ability to bypass American restrictions made Washington's policies appear ineffective. Over time, many businesses and governments around the world saw more value in engaging with India's growing market than in aligning with America's confrontational approach. The net effect was that America lost influence while India gained. Diplomatically, America's attempts to pressure India created sympathy for New Delhi in the global South. Countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America viewed India as a nation standing up to Western dominance, something they had long wanted to do themselves. India's resilience became a model of sovereignty and pride for these nations, while America came across as a power unwilling to respect others' independence. Instead of being the leader of a united front, Washington appeared increasingly isolated, unable to force its will in the way it once could. Even within the U.S., the approach backfired. Indian Americans, one of the most successful and influential immigrant communities, became more politically active and vocal in shaping American policies toward India. Their growing role in business, technology, and politics made it harder for Washington to ignore India's importance. What was meant to be a strategy of pressure turned into a lesson in why cooperation was more effective than confrontation. In the larger picture, America's attempts to harm India revealed the decline of unilateralism. By refusing to bend, India showed the world that even a rising nation could resist the strongest power. This changed perceptions everywhere. America no longer looked invincible, and India looked unstoppable. The result was that Washington's tactics weakened its own position globally. In trying to corner India, America ended up standing more isolated. while India walked forward with new allies, new respect, and a stronger sense of destiny.